I want to thank our sponsor, Planet Ford. Planet Ford has always been a proud supporter of law enforcement in the community, providing customer service and fleet management, sales, and service. If you're looking for that personal quality service, contact Planet Ford in Spring or online at planetford.com. You're listening to Crime Scene Today, where we meet with subject matter experts to discuss current and future issues facing law enforcement, forensics, and crime scene investigations. Today we're discussing fingerprint processing. While attending the International Association for Identification conference in Reno, Nevada, I went to a presentation called Incriminated by Photographs. The topic was identifying fingers and hands captured in evidentiary photos. The presenter is Karen Oswald, a fingerprint expert that works for the Suffolk County Police Department in New York. I had an opportunity to sit down with Karen. She explained how this presentation came about. After my interview with Karen, I'll be talking to co-host and fingerprint expert Leslie McCauley about how smaller agencies with limited budgets can increase the fingerprint processing at their department. Now on to the interview with Karen.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me. My name is Karen Oswald. I'm a senior evidence specialist with the Suffolk County Police Department Identification Section. I've worked for them for almost 14 years as a Latent Print Examiner. We also process major crime scenes, homicides, bank robberies, and police-involved shootings for fingerprint evidence. I also spent 1 year working with the United States Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory as a contractor, as a forensic scientist, latent print examiner in one of their expeditionary labs in Afghanistan.
So your presentation today, just give us briefly, what's the new presentation? What's the new thing that you're doing with fingerprints?
So my presentation today was on identifying hands or palms that appear in evidentiary photographs, which are different from typically what I do as a latent print examiner, which, as you said, would be to dust an item or process an item with chemicals and develop a print that we couldn't see before. In this situation, a detective would recover a photograph of whatever it is that he's investigating, and in that photograph would possibly be somebody holding an object. And because the resolution on camera phones is so good now, I've run into a couple situations where the friction ridge detail on the suspect's hands is identifiable just by looking at the picture.
So how did this first get brought to your attention, that first case or that you, thought to do this?
The first case was from our computer crimes detectives. They were investigating a man who was suspected of having possession of child pornography. And when they did a forensic dump of his computer and his cell phone, they came across 7 images that stuck out as pictures that had been taken as opposed to downloaded. So they were looking at those pictures and they noticed that along with the act that was going on, his hands were visible, and they had the wherewithal to notice that and come up to the ID section and say, hey, is there enough detail here that you guys can actually do something with this?
Now, have you done something like this before they brought this to you?
That was the first time.
And so have you heard of people doing this? Is this something sort of new?
It was new to me, and I immediately wanted to do it, but wasn't sure how to go about it. So I did some research, and I found that a couple other agencies had already done it. There were some investigators in Sarasota, Florida, and Canada, and I think there was one other place that's slipping my mind right now, but I called the investigators down in Sarasota and just talked with them about their case, and they reassured me that their process in identifying the hands was not all that different from identifying latent prints that are developed off of evidence.
And this is very important, as you brought up. The first case you had was a child crime, and I've worked over child crimes for a long time, and also with our ICAC, which are Internet Crimes Against Children. And in those cases, these predators will seek these children. They'll send them photos of themselves. They'll send them photos of their body parts and make suggestive things. But in doing so, obviously, there's a possibility of us actually getting identification, which is very hard to do in internet crimes. I mean, we can get IP addresses, we can get a general location, but actually knowing who's behind that keyboard, knowing who's actually sent this photo is something that's always very challenging in investigations to do. So what were the next steps? What were steps that you took in identifying this?
So the next steps were to take those 7 photo images and analyze them to see which of the images, if any, contained enough friction ridge detail in the hands or the fingers that I could actually make a comparison. And out of those 7, only 2 pictures had identifiable friction ridge skin. So I took those 2 photographs and I analyzed the 3 different areas of friction ridge skin within them. And then, because these had come off of a cell phone, they already knew who the cell phone belonged to, they gave me the name of their suspect, who happened to have a previous arrest from 1987. And I pulled his arrest card from 1987 and made a comparison with one of the areas of friction ridge skin. And I was able to identify his left index finger from one of the photographs. The other photograph had the suitable detail was on the 2nd and 3rd joint, so I needed major case prints before I could complete that comparison.
So explain, for those that don't know, what's a major case print versus our normal prints that we take?
The normal prints that we take when somebody's under arrest are called 10 prints, which is rolling each of the first joints of each of your 10 fingers and then taking flat impressions of each of your 10 fingers. This probably also includes taking a flat palm print. Major case prints involves taking every bit of friction ridge skin on your entire hand. Your whole hand is covered with this special friction ridge skin. It's not just your fingerprints. So major case prints would be the normal 10 fingers that you roll, the normal 10 flats, the normal flat palms, but it also includes the sides of each finger, the joints of each finger, the tips of each finger, and the sides of each of your palms, making sure that you collect all the friction ridge detail on that person's hands.
So that's what you need in one of the photos that, in this case. So I know in your presentation you spoke that there's a different way in looking at, I guess, and analyzing these prints versus the normal prints. If you could explain that.
It's not too different, but you have to remember or take into consideration just a few different things, which a big difference is the distortion. When you have a latent print, that's a print that's left behind in sweats and oils. They're very fragile. They're influenced by a lot of factors. Some of those factors are the substrate, which is the item that you're actually handling. That can cause your finger impression to not look as clear when it's left behind. The other would be the matrix, which is what you're actually leaving behind on that object. Are your prints sweat prints? Are they oil prints? Do you have ink or blood or paint on your hand? Are you leaving a print in something like that? And the other one would be deposition, which is exactly how you handle the object. If you handle an object with a lot of pressure, you're going to cause your print to be a little bit more distorted than if you were to gently place your hand on an object. And those are all things that you take into consideration with a latent print. But when you are looking at the actual hand, none of those factors come into play because you're not touching anything. There's no deposition, distortion, and it doesn't, the only thing that would affect something that's on your, the only reason that something on your hand would affect what I'm looking at is if it's obliterating detail. So what you're looking at in a photograph is more of ground truth. You're not questioning the detail that's there because there's not as much distortion. The distortion that you have to consider when you have a hand in a photograph is that that hand is probably not the focal point of the picture. The person taking the picture is likely holding an object or holding something in its hand, and that's the focal point of the picture. So if you're not focusing on the fingerprints, there's a good chance they're going to be a little bit out of focus, and that's something you have to consider. You also have to consider lighting, whether a flash is present or just ambient light can sometimes cause a glare on the fingers in the photograph. And these are just little things that you have to acknowledge during your analysis and think about how that might affect what you're seeing, and then you're still going through the same process, which is looking for characteristics, looking for patterns, identifying the orientation of the print, the anatomical location. So it's still the same process, just with a little bit of a different mindset.
Now, another challenge that you have, however, is that with our latent prints, we put scales in them, right? And most pedophiles and criminals are not kind enough to bring a scale and hold that in the photo for you. So what do you do to overcome that?
Correct. So when an officer develops a printout at a crime scene, we ask them to put a scale next to it so that when we receive the photograph or the lift, we're able to calibrate that image so that we can print out a one-to-one photo and the print can be entered into our database at a one-to-one size. So with an image where you don't have a scale, you would have to take two different approaches. Either find something in that image that you know can be measured. For instance, I had a case where somebody was holding a gift card to Amazon, and if I had to calibrate that photo, I would have just bought an Amazon gift card, measured the size of the Amazon gift card, and calibrated the image from that. The other two cases I worked were cases, they were photos of a pedophile, and there was nothing to measure in the photograph because they were just body parts, and I would have had to estimate the size of his finger if I had to run it through a database. I didn't have to for either of those cases. One was already calibrated by a different agency, and the other one we had a suspect to compare to, but I would have had to estimate the size of the fingers that I was going to run through the database if that were the situation.
And I know that I've heard in another lecture one of the ways to do that is counting counting edges. Yes, the
Ridges.
So what's the process and sort of? Because I mean, it's not just like when you say estimate, you're not just guessing. I mean, there's certain things that you take into account to try to narrow down the size you're looking at.
Right. If you had a male suspect's finger, he appeared to be a male adult in the photograph, you could measure a couple male adults in your office, see what the size of their first joint of their finger is, and make a rough estimate based on that. If you were not to get a hit in your database based on that, you could increase the size or decrease the size a little bit and run a second set of prints, and then increase it or decrease it a little bit more just to cover all your bases if you don't get a hit again. And the other option would be to count ridges, which some of the databases have a tool where you can actually size a print based on a ridge count. So that's built into the database, which is useful.
And you did some research on your own as far as to see increasing and decreasing, how accurate or how much it changes it. And you found that you could actually, there's a pretty good range there that you still can get your hits.
Yeah, you have a little leeway, which was good to see. I measured the actual size of the first joint of my left middle finger, and then I increased it by 6 millimeters and decreased it by 6 millimeters, and just increased and decreased by another millimeter here and there just to see where the results came back in the database. And it took, I think it was 8 millimeters larger and 4 millimeters smaller before I fell off the top 50 candidate list. And of course, that's going to change with every print, with every database, with every day, depending on whose fingerprints are running through that system. But it's good to know you have a little bit of leeway.
Well, and that, like the first case that you were talking about, you had a known suspect, right? So I mean, you had someone to get major case prints from. But in the case that you were practicing to see how far off it could be, that's just running it through APHIS, running it through a database to check, right?
Correct.
So, and obviously we've talked about child cases, and that's one thing, but there's so many other cases in which we see people putting on Facebook, people putting different things that, and especially you brought up, Amazon cards. Fraud's a big thing, right? I mean, that sadly people still fall for con artists, and they fall for it because the con artists are good. They're good at convincing them of what they want, but many times they'll tell you, take a picture of the cards and send us these things. And the one thing that we've also noticed is that people trying to avoid being caught or using things such as Bitcoin, credit, the gift cards, those type of things. And we're actually seeing this in sex trade and these type of things. So I think that this tool is very useful to try to get out there. What do you think some difficulties would be? Meaning, obviously not every photo is going to work. And so what are some challenges in the photo, I guess, that you would need as a latent examiner to get a hit or to have a good print for identification?
Well, we would have to have an area that has enough clarity with the characteristics that we're looking for. So if too much of the hand is covered by whatever the focal point of the photograph is, then we're not going to be able to work with that. If you don't have enough of the friction ridge skin, you may have a hand in the photograph, but you may not have the palmar surface, which has the friction ridge skin. Not to say that that's not useful. If you are able to make an arrest and you can photograph the back of the suspect's hand, that's not something official that we do in terms of connecting freckles or something like that, but you can still show the picture of the suspect hand and the perp's hand, right, and just show that they are similar and let a jury decide. So really the biggest challenge is just getting enough friction ridge skin with enough characteristics that you can make the ID. Your hand's a pretty big surface and you don't need a lot of it to make it a comparison.
One thing that I thought of when you were doing that, and so I'm not sure if you're aware of the database that NECMIC keeps, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and these are child pornography cases in which things are uploaded and they have examiners that basically are just looking at these photos, trying to identify certain things in the image, whether it's a plug to know, is this a U.S., is this international type of thing or whatever. And I would be curious in all that database is there if some of that type of evidence actually exists that's been overlooked at this point, that we can certainly try to make those connections, right?
Yeah, that was the whole reason for this presentation, is just, the first case I did, it broke my heart, and so much credit to the detectives who investigate this stuff. These are little kids, and that tugs at everybody's heartstrings. But the whole reason behind this presentation was just because I don't think it dawns on people who are not latent print experts to look for fingerprints in the background of these photographs. If I'm a computer crimes detective and I'm looking for a crime against a child, like the photograph that I put up in my presentation, I'm seeing body parts and a little kid's hand, and that's what I'm noticing. I'm not necessarily noticing that the perp's hand is in it also, and there's enough friction ridge detail that I should go call a latent examiner. So really, I think getting the word out there and just putting a little bug in these guys in the back of the minds of the investigators, so that one day they come across the picture and they're like, oh, look at that hand. Let me go talk to my identification section and see if there's something that they can do to help us out here.
No, and you're right. I mean, detectives, when they see those, and just like when you showed the photo in there, it's the first thing that the detective thinks is, I've met the elements of the crime, right? I mean, that's a crime. I'm solid. I mean, you don't think of the fingerprint that's in there, also the link to it. I can tell you on occasion, we probably, in cases I've worked, have passed up photos like that. And we're still searching the IP address, and we're still searching other things to try to track this person down, when there possibly could have been a finger in there that we could have done. And I appreciate you bringing this forward to the detectives. As a matter of fact, as I told you, there's another conference going on this week that's in Dallas. It's the Crimes Against Children Conference, where there's professionals in their field, about 3,000 or 4,000 that investigate these crimes around the world. And we're hoping to share this information with them and get this in the right hands, so that they can take that back and share with their fingerprint examiners. And that's just like this conference. That's what it's all about, is bringing those disciplines together so that we can share this information. And sometimes it's new technology, and sometimes it's old technology is being used in a different way. So
somebody actually came up to me after I spoke today, and he did exactly what I did with a Polaroid from 1980, I think he said it was, which to me was just fascinating. I mean, the camera technology back then was garbage compared to what we have now, but I loved that even back then they were noticing things like this. I mean, we're just another possible open door. Maybe we'll help, maybe we won't, but why not have as many people trying to find an investigative lead as you can?
No, and I appreciate you bringing it forward and making us aware of that, and we're certainly going to share that information, and I appreciate you joining us to share it with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, in speaking with Karen in reference to her print. So she's getting a print off of a photo of a hand because of the increased technology with cell phones, right? They're becoming more clear, and obviously that's sort of what you need for identifying fingerprints is something that's sharp enough that you can get detail in there. Okay, so we've sort of been spreading this message that she had with other law enforcement, with detectives, especially child crimes, that we go through all of these ICAC and we go through all these images and stuff. And if there's the possibility that we see something that could be an identifiable print, to get that into the lab. Now, normally, fingerprint experts are using powders and different chemicals and things to enhance, and this is just straight off of a photo. But one thing that it brings to question, most agencies throughout the U.S. are smaller agencies. They're not large agencies. They're not 500-man agencies, but they're about a 50 to 100-man agency is a typical agency that's out there. Now, just about every agency I know has fingerprint powder, right? Everybody gets a little kit when they get out of the academy and they get some basic training. But I'm just wondering some advice for these agencies that would like to step up their fingerprint game, right? That they can process a little bit more. I mean, how many patrol officers say, I couldn't take prints because of this surface, because of that surface, and how many things that are missing because of that. So if you can give me some ideas of just some basic, sort of like the next level that a department could go to.
Yeah, definitely. So I know a lot of the forensic companies that supply to agencies, they offer various ranges of fingerprint kits. So you can get your basic one that you had mentioned that would probably just have basic black powder and a fingerprint brush. And that's really about it. Maybe some index cards. To expand on that, you can also, there's two different types of basic fingerprint powder. You can do the regular kind of really fine volcanic ash powder, which is great for processing vehicles, covering large areas like windows and things like that. Certainly your metallic objects are great for that, to use that kind of regular powder. There's also magnetic powder that you can use, obviously, on non-metallic objects such as beer bottles, window glass. You can use on that. If you've got the smaller pieces, it's going to be a more fine or a smaller detail because it produces a smaller fingerprint bristle, if you will. When you use a magnetic wand and you create kind of what is like a paintbrush with the magnetic particles, and use that to apply on the non-metallic surfaces. So you certainly wouldn't want to use it on tools such as, burglary tools, crowbars, any kind of tire irons or anything like that, because anything that is metallic is going to attract those magnetic particles. So it's really not going to benefit at all. There are kits that contain different colors of fingerprint powder. So there's certainly white, black, gray, fluorescent, every kind of fluorescent color you can think of.
Now, you've talked before about not using the fluorescent. You're not a fan of using fluorescent powders.
I'm not, and just because I think I was raised old school. So when I first became a crime scene investigator and was learning about fingerprint processing and not only that, but actually going into the fingerprint comparison and identification process, at that point, we as an agency were still on 35 millimeter film. So when you would take lift a fingerprint or develop a fingerprint with fluorescent powder, you have to put that on some kind of contrasting background. So, with us, before Photoshop, before technology was on the scene, we would have to print out photo paper that was black so that we would have a light-colored fluorescent orange or fluorescent yellow fingerprint that developed and put it on a black background or a dark background. So then in order to be able to put it into APHIS or another type of fingerprint search system, you then had to reverse the colors, which meant that we then had to take a picture and be able to flip. So instead of the ridges of the fingerprint being a light color of that fluorescent powder on a dark background, we had to be able to flip that and have dark ridges on a white background or a light background. So that created a lot more steps that had to be done in that process in order to get that. So to avoid that, we just stayed with gray and black as a good contrast, because even on, say, a black vehicle, if you've got a mixture of gray and even with a little bit of black powder in there, you can still get enough contrast. And using oblique lighting or available lighting that you have, you can still see where there's ridge detail, and certainly where there's powder that's adhered to that matrix, whether it be sweat or some other kind of substance that is what the fingerprint was left in. So we just, for ease, until technology caught up, we have just stayed with the gray and the black powders and basic white index cards. There are kits that have pre-designed fingerprint cards that will give you a nice box to draw. And I'm a big fan of drawing a picture because the officer that is developing and lifting the fingerprint has the object right in front of them. But when it goes to being submitted to the lab and going to the examiner or the technician who's going to handle that fingerprint, sometimes things get lost in translation of knowing, okay, which way it was up, which way, what surface was
or the description is that it's on the car door, right? It's
right,
on,
right.
They may put passenger car door, but it's on the door somewhere, right?
Right, absolutely. Sometimes we're not able to get any description, so we then have to track down the officer and get a little bit more information. And that information becomes vital, not only if the case goes to trial, and being able to describe, especially for that initial officer who submitted it, I have a hard enough time remembering what I did last week on a case that I've moved on to other cases. Certainly have a challenge of remembering a year and a half to 2 years down the line if it's then going to trial, if I didn't make notes. So we become very good note takers. But it helps the examiner be able to orient the print and hopefully narrow down their search instead of having to go into the computer system and searching all 10 fingers. If we are fortunate enough to have simultaneous impressions or, have some clues in that print, whether it's a palm print or a fingerprint, we might be able to narrow it down if it's a palm print to the left palm versus the right palm. Or we might be able to, have a kind of an educated guess on maybe an index finger versus searching all 10 fingers. So the more specific we can get or the more information we can get, it certainly helps the search parameters.
Well,
but going back, go ahead.
Well, I gather that also, the location is going to be sort of probative too, as to, if this is on the outside of a car door, then should they have been there or not? But being on the outside, depending on the type of crime we're dealing with, it may not be, someone passing by in a parking lot, someone that's in the apartment complex, if it's not inside, it may not be as of great value as where other ones are.
Absolutely. One of my favorite examples to give when I'm teaching to groups is imagine that you've been able to develop a fingerprint or a palm print on a beer bottle. Say it's a thumbprint. So there's a huge difference as to whether it is orientated in the normal position of where somebody would be picking up that beer bottle and drinking from it, to where maybe it's more angled towards the top of the bottle, versus if somebody had picked it up by the neck of the bottle and used it as a weapon. So where the orientation might be more down towards the base of the bottle. So that orientation can be huge for any piece of evidence. So the more detail, the better. There are kits available that have those pre-made latent cards that will have the information that is helpful. So not only the object, where it was lifted, what the offense is, the case number, the officer's name, the date and the time. And it kind of prompts the officer if they're, if this is something that they don't usually do on a regular basis, that it hasn't become second nature. It kind of helps them figure out what information needs to go on an index card.
So now a lot of that stuff's in the basic kit, as you said. I mean, we get the
Sure.
black powder, and sometimes we'll even get the magnetic. So what's the next step? What's the like if someone's starting to look at their budget, and depending on how much money they can spend and take it to the next level, where would be the next place you could see a smaller department going?
So another easy thing to get their hands on would be aerosol ninhydrin. So ninhydrin is a chemical that reacts with the amino acids, which is located in sweat. It is used for porous items, so forged checks, threatening letters, any kind of paper or cardboard. I had a aggravated robbery many years ago. That was a home invasion, and the suspects pretended to be delivery men and forced their way into the home while they were carrying a cardboard box. And I was able to develop latent prints on the cardboard box as well as the packaging tape, which ultimately led to one of the suspects being identified and convicted. So there's certainly many tools available, but ninhydrin is a very, very easy thing. In our lab, we use it in a vent hood that has, the recycled air, or it recycles the chemical through so that you're not breathing the fumes. But it could also be done outside where there's good ventilation. You don't have to worry about being in an enclosed environment. Here in Texas, we have the added benefit of our humidity is generally pretty high.
It's already built in.
11 months out of the year. Yeah. So that is one of the things that helps accelerate the development of any fingerprints with ninhydrin or latent prints with ninhydrin. So in areas where the humidity is really low, they have to introduce humidity into the environment. Some people have developed them with the steam of an iron, like a clothes iron. Like I said, in Texas, we don't have that problem,
right,
at least in our area. One of the very few benefits of the humid weather that we have. There are times where, depending on the environment, depending on the climate, it might take several days for it to develop any latents that might be there. But for us, we generally start seeing some development within a few hours. It's just knowing your environment that you're in. But that's something that is easily obtained. You don't have to mix chemicals because the companies now offer them pre-mixed in an aerosol can. When it's gone, you just throw it away. You don't have to worry about any kind of mixing of chemicals or preparing of anything, and then worrying about the shelf life with that. So that would be something small agencies could invest in for their patrol officers, or even, if they've only got a couple of technicians that are doing this work. So that's certainly one thing.
Then I would gather that another option, I know many people have done this, especially smaller age stuff, is to have, you can certainly buy the forensic tank, right? But most people can go get a fish tank and things like that to use CA. So obviously that's sort of, I guess in my opinion, sort of another next step in your fingerprinting, right?
Absolutely. So CA, meaning the cyanoacrylate, the super glue, is definitely a must, whether it is with a forensic tank that's designed to control the humidity level and recycle those fumes as well, versus one that is homemade. We actually still have a fish tank that we utilize on a daily basis. It was probably made somewhere between 25 and 30 years ago, and it still functions perfectly fine.
It's still a box with glass, right?
Yeah, it's a box with glass, and I'm sure the forensic companies are not happy to hear that. However, there are benefits to getting one that is forensically designed, if that fits into the budget. So yes, that is a must. So the idea with any kind of super glue fuming is when the super glue is heated up, the fumes dissipate within that chamber. And any kind of non-porous object, again, beer bottle, screwdriver, cell phone, any kind of surface that is a non-porous surface can be super glued. And what that does is it stabilizes the latent prints that may be on that object. The benefit to stabilizing it with super glue is it allows that examiner to be able to process it in multiple ways and multiple times. Take that beer bottle again. If I had a beer bottle with latent prints on it and I did not super glue fume it, I might be able to dust it with powder, lift off the latents, maybe dust it again. If I'm really, really lucky and it had a lot of residue on it, I might be able to dust it and lift it a third time. But generally, it's 1 to 2 lifts. If I have super glue fumed it and stabilized that fingerprint, then I can dust it with powder, I can lift it, I can dust it again, I can lift it, I can apply chemicals, dye stains, and be able to photograph it. So it allows
Gives you
more
some more
versatility
options.
for the
Right.
examiner. Yes, absolutely. More ways to capture the best detail possible. So, and then another favorite of mine is sticky side powder. I absolutely love sticky side powder. It is fantastic when dealing with duct tape. It will develop latents on the non-adhesive side as well as the adhesive side. And I use it on packaging tape. It's more challenging. Certainly, it's not a good choice for very porous tapes like masking tape or painter's tape. But any type of home invasion that we typically will get, we'll usually utilize duct tape. And so we come across that more, I would say, than other types of tape. So that is very easy to mix up and very easy to use. You just need a little bit of running water in order to rinse the tape once the sticky side powder is applied to it, and then just allow the tape to air dry, and then you would follow up with photographing any latents that were developed on it.
I know that many drug dealers use it to package their drugs and such for your large drug cases. I only bring that up because I know you spent how many days processing that case?
Oh, yes.
At least
yes.
a week or so.
Yes.
So you're well versed in using sticky side powder.
Absolutely. And like I said, it's one of my favorites. Mostly because even a beginner examiner or beginner technician can use it and have good results. If there's any prints there, and you take the time and the care to apply the chemical, and you can reapply it if you don't get any luck the first time. Sometimes that does help, but it's either there or it's not there.
Right.
So it's certainly not something that you have to go away to a week-long formal training school in order to learn how to do. And along the lines with the duct tape, one of the little tips that we've always try to pass on to new officers is to go to the dollar store and get a box of wax paper. If you come across a home invasion or an ag assault where a victim was taped up, and if you take that wad of tape or whatever condition it's in and throw it in a brown evidence bag, it's just going to stick to the brown bag, and you're going to get that in the lab, and all of the sticky side, which would be great for fingerprints, is now covered with brown paper. And so if you've ever tried to take tape off of gift wrap at Christmas time or at birthday, it just does nothing but destroy the paper, and it doesn't help the adhesive side. It's the same thing that would happen. And so if you get some wax paper and you wrap that up, roll the bundle up or wrap the bundle up in the wax paper, it will stick to the wax paper, but it will peel off of the wax paper and allow you to be able to process it. So something that'll cost you $1, maybe $2 at the most at the store is a very easy addition to throw in a patrol car and have accessible.
So now I know one problem that many officers see when they're trying to process cars and different rough type of services, and how many reports we've gotten back, unsuitable for prints, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. So, and after you get more deep into it, certainly you're an expert in it, there's very few surfaces that you can't do something to get prints off of. Is there something sort of at the patrol level or one step up to on those textured or different type of surfaces like that?
Well, there's a couple of different techniques and different things that you can utilize. I became a fan of the hinge tape lifts. Instead of using a roll of fingerprint tape, there's pads that are pre-made that have about 50 or 100 sheets of tape that are part of this pad. I think they're great, especially for processing vehicles outside, especially if it's on a windy day. It never fails. Murphy's Law, you're going to develop this beautiful palm print or fingerprint, and you go to put your tape on it, the wind is going to catch it, and the tape is going to fold back over on itself, or, it's going to create a crease when you're trying to lift that print off. These tape lifts, I think, are wonderful because they have a tab at the top where you can easily hold onto it without depositing your own fingerprints on the tape, which is always ideal.
Right.
And it'll allow you to smooth that out over the surface and be able to lift it partially off of the vehicle, but still be anchored onto that vehicle or whatever surface you're using to process, and be able to slide your index card under that and then smooth the tape right over the index card without it ever coming detached from your surface. So those are fantastic. Certainly they probably cost more than a roll of tape, but in the grand scheme of things, I think that's a very good investment, especially for the patrolman who's going to be processing out in the field and dealing with elements. Another, obviously, certainly a camera. I mean, that's one of the...
That's a must on all of them, right?
That's probably the most immediate.
It looked amazing. I drew it for you here.
That's right. I drew it on a card. No, certainly a camera. And, it doesn't have to be the most expensive DSLR camera. If that budget isn't there are decent point-and-shoot cameras that have macro settings. The patrol cameras that we issue are certainly not top of the line, but they do the job. And there is a macro setting. And so we teach our officers that, you might have to step back. You're not going to be able to put the camera lens, 2 inches away from your fingerprint, because this camera is not designed to do that. But it will zoom in to capture a good detailed picture. In a scale is necessary. Yeah. So,
go back to that, requiring more work of you.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially if it's something that's going to go into an APHIS system. There's got to be the proper proportion in order for the computer to be able to read the print or see the print properly, I guess is a better term. But yeah, a scale is necessary. And, it could be the dollar store roller if that's all you can do. There's 6-inch scales that are very cheap to get from the
We'd rather
company.
you not use a pen. A pen is not a scale. A pencil is not a scale.
Right.
Anything with actual markings on it would be awesome.
Right. It's funny you say that, because several years ago I had a brand new detective who had developed a fingerprint or a palm print, I think it was, and took beautiful pictures, and he didn't have a roller, didn't have a scale available. And we tell them, if you've got to use your business card or a quarter, something like that, don't use a paper clip, because when I look at the picture, I'm not going to be able to tell if it's a standard paper clip or a jumbo paper clip.
Right.
But he used his pen. And so I was like, wow, this is a beautiful photograph, but it's a pen. Right. So I got a hold of him. I said, hey, I got your fingerprint pictures. They're phenomenal. Do you by chance have that pen still? And he's like, yes, I sure do. I said, great. I need you to come up to the crime lab so I can photograph that with a scale. Right. So that's what I did. I photographed that. I scaled the pen, so I got the proper measurements. And then I used that to scale the fingerprint and the palm print to be able to have it at 1-to-1. So there's ways. It might be a little bit extra step in there if somebody uses a pen. But things that are standard size, business cards, quarter, things like that. if you can't get a ruler, obviously a ruler is certainly the
Preferable.
ideal situation.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point, because I know that we've been told if you go to any forensic photography and stuff, you're told over and over, shooting raw, shooting TIFF, shooting anything but a lossy compression such as JPEG. However,
Right.
if you go to the standards, that so the IAI, has different divisions that sort of cover all these things and different standards, and one of those is the Imaging Technology Scientific Working Group. And one of the things that they cover in there is they say, it's a myth that you have to shoot in RAW or in TIFF for it to be an identifiable print. And basically
Right.
their rule of what they say is that no, you can, it's preferred, sort of like we talked about the ruler, right? It's preferred that it's shot in RAW or it's shot in TIFF. However,
Absolutely.
if it's shot in JPEG and an examiner is able to see enough detail to make an identification, then it's solid. It's, it all comes down to the
Absolutely.
examiner and what, they're able to identify in the print.
Absolutely, and the ability to take pictures with the camera as well. You might have a fantastic print, a fantastic camera, but if you're not taking your time and properly framing that fingerprint in the camera to get a 90-degree or perpendicular picture, or a clear one at that, have it in focus, then it's really not going to do that much good.
Right.
So,
No, it's not.
Practicing is definitely key there too.
So just, in wrapping up some things as far as tips, we've talked about regular powder, magnetic powder, then taking a step up to anhydrous, and go get a fish tank if you can't afford one of the more expensive fuming tanks to do some CA, and then on to sticky side. And what else did I miss? Was there one in there?
I think that pretty much covered it. The anhydrous, sticky side, different colors. If you want to, if you have access to Photoshop, then it's certainly a lot easier now with technology than it was years ago under the 35 millimeter film.
Right.
But yes, technology has certainly made it a lot easier. So if you want to play with forensic or fluorescent powders, you certainly can do that. Just know that the nature of them, you're going to have a more limited use for them, I guess, versus the standard black and gray powders. They also make powders in white. So those are great for black trash bags. Sometimes with narcotics cases, we get black trash bags. So white powders and fluorescent powders do great on those. So it just kind of depends on what type of evidence that you would typically encounter in your jurisdiction, and the type of offenses that you're going to be getting evidence from. And
Most of the powders
what
and
you
the
have
colors
available.
seem to be based on what the background is, right? I mean, we're trying to develop contrast, so
Right.
the end result that the examiner can see it better.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think that will wrap us up for today. We appreciate you giving some advice on some fingerprints. So thank you very
Absolutely.
much.
You're welcome. I'm happy to help.